Socrates is now going to try and show that the soul has very similar parts, very analogous parts to the city, and that the arrangement of those parts is analogous to the way the parts are arranged in the city. Now, this is, as a side note, a little bit different than the way we tend to think about psychology today, because really, when Socrates is talking about the soul, he's talking about the psyche. Today, we tend to think of the psyche largely in, let's call it biological terms or physiological terms. So if you've taken psychology classes, you know, for example, there are questions about what part of the brain is our capacity for speech located at, and what part of the brain is responsible for our involuntary activities, like our regulating involuntary activities like breathing and pumping the blood and so forth. Okay, so that's not the kind of thing that Socrates is going to try and do. And in part, it's because of a kind of philosophical difference. Socrates thinks that all things have a purpose or a function. So you remember, this whole question of justice at the level of the soul is, what is the purpose or function of living? And Socrates is going to say, isn't the overall purpose or function of living to live well? And isn't one way we could describe living well as the just life? So in the same way, there might be the purpose of a horse. This is from an earlier passage, but isn't there a purpose to a horse running quickly? And isn't there a purpose to a human being living well? It's this kind of reasoning. It's kind of purpose-driven philosophy. And Socrates wants us all to have a purpose-driven life. So if the whole of the soul has a purpose, and that is justice, we've got to make sure that each part of the soul is fulfilling its purpose or its function. And this is precisely analogous to the way that Socrates thought that the purpose of being a ruler was to make decisions, the purpose of being a soldier was to guard the moral and the physical order of the city, and the purpose of being a producer was to produce things. Okay, so what's the first part of the soul? The first part of the soul is what Socrates is going to call reason. And what reason aims at or strives for is truth. So reason is the capacity that allows us to be wise. Reason is the capacity that allows us to engage in philosophical dialogue. And reason, if properly educated, allows us to see the truth. Okay, so reason is the dominant capacity for a Socrates type of person. This is the kind of driving force of their life. Sharpening and cultivating their reason is their overall aim. Okay, so reason is what allows us to say that Socrates types are reasonable, and reason is what allows us to say that Socrates types should be in charge of the city as a whole. You've got a different kind of faculty or capacity in the second slide. And this is a word that gets translated into English as spirit. And it's the dominant capacity for a glaucon type. Spirit is the part of our soul that is geared towards and striving for recognition. So if you were a very competitive kind of person and you're really driven to play sports or to compete with music or to win arguments and so forth, that's all good, as long as the desire for winning doesn't get the better of your reason. That's all good as long as your spirited element in the soul is under the supervision, under the guardianship of your reason. And that's all good as long as you can compete without acting dishonorably, in a shady way, in a dishonest way, and so forth. So this spirit strives for the recognition of other people, but in sort of the right way, in an honorable way. Okay, and this is the kind of faculty or capacity that will be dominant in this Glaucon type, in the soldier type, for example. They're going to need this kind of competitive drive in order to fulfill their function as courageous soldiers the best. Okay. Finally, we've got a third element in the soul, appetite. Appetite, it's sometimes translated as desires. And the idea is this part of the soul, everyone's got it, but it happens to be the dominant capacity or the dominant faculty for cephalous types. And as you remember, the cephalous type in the just city is just everybody else. And so the idea here is that most people will not be particularly striving for either truth or recognition. The main thing they want is to have pleasure. And once again, everybody wants pleasure. And once again, there's nothing wrong with pleasure as long as these strivings for pleasure don't get out of control. As long as you're not doing anything unreasonable, as long as you're not doing anything dishonorable, as long as you're not upending the proper order of the soul, which is to have reason in charge and to have spirit helping reason be in charge, all for the sake of regulating and guiding your appetites or your desires. So you see here, this is the analogy between justice in the soul and justice in the city. Socrates is saying, in the just soul, the reasoning capacity is going to be the ruling capacity. The spirited capacity is going to be in the helping to rule capacity. And in the third position is the capacity that needs to be educated, that needs to be led, that needs to be restrained, and that needs to be ruled. And so just to make this analogy explicit, Socrates is also concerned with establishing parallel relations of ruler and ruled within the city. He's saying that the ruler guardian needs to make the decisions, and the helper guardians need to help carry those decisions out. And that third category, that everybody else, needs to be led, educated, protected, and ultimately ruled. Okay, so that's the analogy between justice in the city and justice in the soul. And at this point, what we've got is the full definition of justice. Just to review, the full definition of justice is each part is doing the job or function for which it is best naturally suited. And as a corollary, or actually an implication of that definition, each part is striving to fulfill some kind of purpose or aim. So truth in the soul is striving for, reason in the soul is striving for truth. Philosophers in the city are striving for wisdom. Okay. And when each part is striving for its purpose and fulfilling its proper function, then the overall soul or the overall city is just. So we've seen the definition of justice, And we've seen how the definition of justice applies in the case of the city, and how the definition of justice applies in the case of the soul. And we've seen why those two cases are analogous for Socrates. We're talking about Book 5 today, and I would like to talk about two things. The first is the role of gender, especially the relations between men and women in the guardian household. And as you'll note, the guardians are supposed to have one household, one big, basically collective household. And we'll talk about that proposal in a minute. The second thing I want to do today is talk about this position of the ruler guardians. As I was saying on Wednesday, Socrates' idea is if the leadership can get its house in order, and I really meant the guardian households, the thing we'll be talking about in part 1 of today's lecture. If the leadership can get its house in order, then the entire city will have its house in order. So Socrates, in this second part of the lecture, is going to explain to us who are these ruler guardians, because they are, in a way, the most politically important part of the city. And this is once again to emphasize everybody is important in fulfilling the needs and the overall purpose of the city. You can't do it without people who actually produce things. You can't do it without people who actually exchange things and lend money and so forth. However, for the political order, for the question of who's in charge of the city, the ruler guardians are uncontestably, for Socrates, the most important. So we're going to spend some time really explaining who they are and what qualifies them for this position of rule. And this is where Socrates will explain probably the most famous idea out of this entire 300 plus page book. It's the idea of the philosopher king, which is just two ordinary words, philosopher and king, put together into a kind of compound word. Okay. Gender in the guardian household. Socrates wrote extensively about gender in this book. And the thing to note is that in some ways, he's a very traditional Greek male. And he's utterly conventional. And in other ways, he is, and this is in scare quotes, not because we're making fun of radical feminists, but because the term didn't exist back then. In other ways, he's a radical feminist. Side note, feminist in the sort of contemporary sense we use it today, as somebody who believes in women's equality and fights for the emancipation of women and so forth, that didn't come around until about the 19th century. So the scare quotes are to show that we're taking a term that exists now and kind of projecting it back into the past. Historians call that anachronism. Anachronism, if you want to look that term up, or if you already know it. The most traditional thing about Socrates in his gender relations is that he doesn't dialogue with women. Many of us have heard of something called the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test is a kind of guide for evaluating Hollywood and other films. And the test is, are there at least two women in the movie who talk about something that does not involve men? The idea is it's a rough and ready way of just testing how far the movie is willing to consider women as independent from men, as having their own concerns that don't involve men, and so on. Well, you'll notice here that the Republic fails the Bechdel test. Not that it was meant to be examined in this way, but the reason it would fail the Bechdel test is there are no women in the dialogue. There's not even a woman character in this dialogue. And this is very Greek. And the reason why I say that is philosophy for Socrates was part of public affairs. So these debates did not happen um, in private settings where nobody could see them. So when Socrates was doing his Q&A, he was often in the marketplace of Athens. And people would gather around and watch Socrates and somebody reputed to be wise holding this philosophical dialogue. And as you'll notice, even though the Republic, the dialogue we're reading, is taking place outside of the marketplace, it's happening at somebody's house, there's a lot of people involved. There's a whole bunch of people involved, and they're supposed to represent different types of people that you would encounter in your own city. So they represent the public. They represent the different kinds of people you'd find in a city. Okay, and the reason why women aren't there is because there was a Greek, we would call it patriarchal idea, that women's place was not in public affairs, but in private households. And that their role, their primary role, was having children and raising children, socializing children, and the like, making sure those children grow up to be healthy, functioning adults, and so forth. Okay, so that's one way that Socrates is not challenging the gender norms of his society, his city, in the slightest. You'll also notice that Socrates expresses patriarchal attitudes. That when he discusses things like honor, you remember with regards to that second part of the soul, that part of the soul is in charge of making sure our conduct is honorable and praiseworthy and nothing to be ashamed of and nothing you'd be embarrassed to tell your parents about and so forth. When he talks about honor, for example, of the soldier, he says, isn't it true that our soldiers, because they've been properly educated and they've had this moral education that brings out the courage in their soul, is not going to act in a disrespectful way towards its defeated enemies? Isn't it true that if you desecrate the body of your enemy by kicking it and mutilating it and stealing the money, aren't you acting like a dog who, instead of barking at the person who threw a stone, barks at the stone itself? And the analogy here is that the soul in a body is analogous to the person who threw a stone and a stone. And Glaucon or Adeimantus, it doesn't actually matter who responds here. They say, yeah, that's totally right. And Socrates then makes sure to say, and this is the patriarchal attitudes here, he says that's bitchy. He says that's like a female dog. So he's saying you're both acting like an animal which is lower than a proper human being, but he's also making sure to call that kind of behavior, well, what he would consider petty and feminine. Okay, so if you'd like to see those passages, it's on 187, 469D, the paragraph marker. So that's where Socrates basically is a traditional male. Why would I say that Socrates in other respects is more like what we today would call a radical feminist? Well, first of all, you remember that long education process that Socrates was telling us would help us determine who is qualified for what jobs and help take that sort of natural talent or knack and develop it into a virtue or excellence? Socrates' claim was that both women and men, in other words, boys and girls, would be taking part in that education on the exact same terms. So we'll talk more about this when it comes to Mary Wollstonecraft, who actually was, in contemporary terms, a radical feminist. But when the first claims about women's education were being made, they were typically made on behalf of what was called women's education, as in a separate kind of education, an education which would be more geared towards, say, household duties and the understanding that women would be educated so that they could raise children and run a household and learn some household skills like cleaning, cooking, and so forth. Okay, so that's not what Socrates is after at all. Socrates is saying that men and women should actually be educated on the exact same terms. And for somebody in the 5th century BC, in a patriarchal society, a society where the idea is basically men should be in charge, both of the household and of the city as a whole, that was a pretty radical claim. Now, if women are being educated on the same terms as men, and the educators are trying to see, well, which women are courageous and which women are wise, that means women's qualifications to become soldiers are exactly the same as men's qualifications to become soldiers. And it's the same difference with the philosopher position. A woman with a philosophical mind who has the capacity for reasoning, who has the potential to become wise, will be qualified to be a philosopher on the exact same terms that a man would be qualified to become a philosopher. So the bottom line of this radicalism is Socrates thinks it's no more relevant to say, well, this soldier is bald and this soldier has long hair, than it is to say that this soldier is a woman and this soldier is a man. And the same goes for being a philosopher. Does it matter if a philosopher is left-handed or right-handed? No, Socrates says, because we're talking about qualifications to fulfill a particular aim or purpose. And being left-handed or right-handed is neither here nor there. So if it doesn't matter if philosophers are left-handed or right-handed, why does it matter if a philosopher happens to have this kind of body or that kind of body? Okay, so that's the claim for women's education and for women's, what we would say today, meritocratic advancement. Socrates is going to try and take it a step farther. So as I was mentioning, the patriarchal idea was that women should stay at home, and in the household, they would not ultimately be in charge. The husband slash father, that person would be in charge. Socrates is saying, at least for the guardian class, you've got to take that private household up by the roots and tear it out and tear it up. He does not want the guardian group or the guardian class to have private households. He does not really make clear whether he says non-guardians will have private households. And most interpreters say that the everybody else category actually will have private households. So why would Socrates try and introduce this difference in lifestyle within the city? That's our puzzle for this slide. Well, let's explain what the difference in lifestyle is, and then let's try and explain why Socrates thinks this difference in lifestyle is important. So the guardian household is supposed to be one big happy family. Instead of a private household where you eat meals separately, Socrates thinks that all the guardians, that means the rulers as well as the helpers, will be eating in giant dining halls, kind of like mess halls in the army or the cafeteria at a public school. So they're going to share in their meals and enjoy their food together, eat the same meals. And it doesn't stop there. Instead of private marriages, where basically just two people get married and everybody else watches, Socrates wants the guardians to have a common marriage ritual. Every year, say, all the people who are going to get married participate in this marriage ritual. So it's a big mass wedding. And if the marriages are common, it's just one extra step on Socrates' reasoning to common mating rituals. And maybe, yes, there will be some discretion and the couples will go off to separate areas of the city so it's not like an orgy or something wild and unreasonable. Socrates would say like that. But yeah, there will be a time when it comes time for coupling and for baby making. And when those babies are born, instead of, well, there's going to be private households and the mother of each private household will care for that child and so forth, there's going to be a big old nursery. And the kids who were created in this large mating ritual will be raised up by people whose job is to care for the kids, who have a knack for it, who have a talent for it, who have kind of caring as one of their dominant characteristics of the soul. So it's not going to be the philosopher's job, it's not going to be the soldier's job, but the kids will be reared up in common. And the sum total of all these common meals, marriages, mating, child rearing, and there's probably more, the sum total of this is going to be everyone in this guardian household is going to consider each other part of the same family. And that's what I meant here by saying kinship. Socrates says, aren't all the guardians in our city going to consider everybody in the same generation as their brothers and sisters? And aren't they going to consider everyone in the previous generation to be their common parents, their collective parents? And the generation before that, their collective or common grandparents, and the same goes for their kids and their grandkids. Isn't that how they're going to see themselves and feel about each other? And this language of feeling is actually pretty important because Socrates thinks one of the big problems of your typical city is that when some parts of the city or certain classes of the city are hurting, the other parts of the city, especially if those other parts are elevated above the hurting part, don't feel it. So to be more concrete about this, let's say there's an oligarchy and the people, the common people, are suffering. Let's say the poor are suffering. They haven't got enough to eat. But because the rich people are doing fine and they've got more than enough to eat, and they don't see how their policies may be actually harming poor people and making it hard for them to get things to eat, they don't really care. They don't feel the pain of the least well-off part. And that's a situation that Socrates thinks goes against the very spirit of being a guardian or being a ruler, because when you're guarding somebody, you're looking out for their welfare. That's the bottom line of what Socrates means by guarding them. Okay, so it's very important, Socrates thinks, that private interests are eliminated from the guardians. You're not going to have a separate class of rulers with each of them a private household. And if they don't have private interests, how can they corrupt their public charge in the pursuit of private interests? The guardians will not be allowed to have money, Socrates says, because the problem is in private households, let's say a monarchy, the king is always trying to enrich his family and make his private household rich. Okay, how can you do that if the guardian household is supported at public expense and they're not allowed to handle money themselves? Okay, so what Socrates is trying to do is eliminate the problem of public power being used corrupted, Socrates would say, to pursue private household interests. Another way of saying this is Socrates thinks that the city has to be unified. So this is a bit counterintuitive because I started this slide off talking about how Socrates thinks that the guardians are going to have public households, whereas everybody else will be allowed to have private households. But the purpose of this arrangement, Socrates says, is to allow the guardians to not be distracted by private pursuits and private interests so they can actually do their job of ruling for the good of the entire city. Okay, so that's how this differentiation of roles is actually supposed to unify the city, to allow the guardians to notice when other people are suffering, to allow the guardians to notice when other people are happy and flourishing. The problem with these other cities, Socrates says, is that ruling is based on the wrong qualifications. Ruling should be based on virtues and excellences. It should be based on things like courage and wisdom. The problem is, in most cities, ruling is based on one of two things. It's either wealth, and that's the case of oligarchies. So in an oligarchy, for example, to have a share in political power, there would be certain property requirements. Or in oligarchies, they'd say, you have to have this much money in order to take part in government. Okay, so that's oligarchy. And the other case, and this is a case that Socrates would have been very familiar with, the claim was numbers. The claim was rule of the majority. And the claim is every citizen, just by virtue of being a citizen, has the same voice, the same vote as every other citizen. And so the claim of the ordinary people to rule was based on, hey, there are more of us. Okay, so it wasn't wealth, but numbers. Who are these ruler guardians? Socrates says they will be philosopher kings. Socrates is now going to try and define the ruler guardian role as the combination of the job or role of being a philosopher and the job or role of being a king. So after this long digression on gender in the guardian household and the communal nature of the guardian household, Socrates now shows his hand. Here's what the political proposal of the Republic really boils down to, that the philosopher king will be in charge in the just city. If you had to reduce this entire book down to a formula, that would be it. The philosopher king should rule. Socrates realizes this proposal is unlikely, not least for the reason that it violates so many common understandings of his fellow Greeks. One of those understandings, as we'll see next week, is that philosophers are useless. The sophists, they're useful. Philosophers are useless. Okay, so why would you put a useless person in charge of the city? That just doesn't make sense. So the proposal is unlikely, but Socrates says the proposal is not impossible. It's not impossible in the sense that we could at least imagine a few scenarios that would lead to this outcome. And this is just Socrates laying out the logic of the argument. He's not talking about a particular time or a place. Philosophers like to call this hypothetical scenarios. But hypothetical doesn't mean impossible. It just means it can mean unlikely. Okay, so imagine that there is a philosopher who becomes a king or a king who becomes a philosopher. Now, I know this sounds extremely circular almost. Isn't this just the definition of the philosopher king? But Socrates then tries to show some stories that would make this situation real. So imagine that you're in a city-state and that the people at large in this city state actually have great respect for philosophers, and that when a Socrates type came unto them, they did not hate him and think he was annoying and want to kill him, but rather they respected him, they revered his wisdom, and they thought, wouldn't our city be a lot better if we just put this Socrates type in charge? Okay, so that's again unlikely, especially given the actual death of Socrates and his actual conflict with Athenian democracy, but it's not impossible. We could at least imagine such a scenario as occurring. And in the second case, what you've got is basically there's already a king, and the king wants to improve himself. He wants to attain certain virtues or excellences. He wants to continue his education. And so he hires a philosopher type, a Socrates type, who is supposed to bring out the king's capacity for morality and thereby make him more and more philosophical. And so this is the case of a king becoming a philosopher. Again, perhaps unlikely, but is it really in every possible world impossible? Probably not. Thing to note about this proposal is it is either monarchical or aristocratic. It would be monarchical, and the city would have a philosopher king, king in the singular, if there were one person, a Socrates type, who raised himself above everybody else, who distinguished himself like nobody else, and everybody recognized this one person should be at the top of our pyramid. So in this three-tiered pyramid, there would just be one person in that ruler guardian position. It would be aristocratic if you had a city that was more like there were many Glaucon and Adeimantus types. Remember, these are the main partners in Socrates' dialogue at this point. And they were, as a class, superior to other people in their courage and wisdom, but there was no one person that just jumped out. In which case, that Glaucon and Adeimantus type should probably be in the ruler guardian because that's the best the city could achieve. And so we've got an aristocracy. And aristocracy means rule of the best. As I was pointing out before, this proposal is anti-oligarchic because the basis of rule is moral excellence, and it's anti-democratic for the same reason. It's moral qualification that puts the ruling power into a person's hands. The problem with oligarchy is it's based on wealth. The problem with democracy is it's based on numbers. Okay, there's some more to say here about what the philosopher knows and how the philosopher attains moral excellence, but we're already over time. So thank you for your patience.